A statewide investigation uncovers an alarming number of police officers with criminal convictions. The nation's highest court weighs DACA and the future of 700,000 dreamers brought here as children. And wildfires destroy more than structures. A look at the impact on survivors' mental health. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, KPBS science and technology reporter Shalina Chetlani, reporter Jesse Marks of Voice of San Diego, and Max Rieland-Nadler, who covers immigration and the border for KPBS News. Well, a disturbing number of police officers in California have criminal records. Hundreds of officers across the state have in the past decade, or were in the past decade, I should say, convicted of crimes, including dozens of officers in San Diego. Voice of San Diego was among 30 newsrooms investigating cops who commit crimes. And we'll get to how that remarkable reporting effort came together in a minute. But Jesse, start with the convicted officers. Generally, what happens to them?
Well, what happens to them is inconsistent, actually. Some of them are fired, some of them are not. They keep their jobs, they keep their badges as well as their guns. And in most cases, they wind up pleading down to lesser offenses than they're initially charged with. So how they're actually handled within the criminal justice itself is really a case-by-case basis, but we did find some trends over the course of reporting this. And in San Diego County, we found that a lot of these guys who'd started off with more serious offenses, and I say guys because most of them were men in law enforcement, they wound up pleading down to disturbing the peace. About half of them total pleaded down to lesser charges, but it was mostly for a PC 415 violation. Then we also found across the state that a third of the convicted police officers who kept their jobs were initially charged with a violent crime. So we found that locally as well, but on the state level to a pretty prominent degree.
Now, some cases, of course, are high-profile cases. We've talked in this show a lot of officers accused of sexually molesting several women, and those cases get a lot of notoriety. But you started your story with one such San Diego officer who's still on the job, and that case really didn't get any publicity at the time of the occurrence. Give us a summary of that one.
So in that case, that was 2011, and it was a police officer with San Diego. He was accused of knocking his wife unconscious. He broke her cell phone. The sheriff's department responded and ultimately charged him with corporal injury to his spouse and a couple of additional charges after that. And what struck out to us about the case was, one, that he ultimately pleaded down to a property damage crime, not for the actual charge of violence, which was common among officers who were charged with domestic violence-related crimes. But what also stood out to us was the fact that his profession, him being in law enforcement, was a topic of conversation in the courtroom. So one of the things that we wanted to analyze with this series of stories was, how does the criminal justice system evaluate its own members? And in that case, we found that a prosecutor had pushed for a criminal protective order, but the judge wound up going with a less severe restraining order and no negative contact order, citing the defendant's background in law enforcement. It's not entirely clear why that is. It's sort of a nonsensical ruling, but that's what we found in any case. And at the end of that, when everything was said and done, the officer kept his job, he kept his badge and his gun, and we found subsequent evidence that authorities have gone to his house over the years on several occasions to investigate additional domestic disturbances. So he was still a patrol officer. He was still likely responding to domestic violence calls, but himself was the subject of them. Now,
do we know how many other officers have been convicted of crimes yet remain on the job?
So we tallied at least 6 in San Diego, 1 in Imperial County as well, and we're still in the process of verifying some of those. And we've only produced names within our database that we could verify through court documents or with the defendants themselves or with the police department. So I say at least 6, but there's actually more, and there's still a lot that we don't actually know.
And I mentioned at the outset there was a remarkable bit of reporting coming together from a lot of newsrooms. This all kind of started with a pair of enterprising reporters at UC Berkeley. Give us the quick rundown of how that came about.
Yeah, so there are 2 reporters up there who asked the state for a list of notices between the AG's office and POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, and they wanted a list of any officers who'd been disqualified from serving in law enforcement because of criminal convictions. And so what they got instead was a list of 12,000 names, but it had no context to it. And immediately the state went silent and the reporters couldn't figure out how the list had actually been created or why it was given to them, but they realized very quickly it was just too many names for them to check themselves. So they started tapping newsrooms across the state of California to help them with the fact-checking and vetting process, and we ultimately identified 630 members of law enforcement with criminal convictions, and that included people who had been charged and convicted before they became officers.
These are in California, right?
It was in the state of California, right. Or while they were law enforcement officers, or even in a couple of cases after they were cops.
And the Attorney General wasn't happy about all of this.
No, he responded to the reporters up in Berkeley by basically saying this list was released by accident. It should not have been given to you, and destroy it, please. I should note that we don't think that the list should be secret and it should be public, and the fact that Becerra didn't actually follow up with his threat should be telling. Now,
there's research showing, according to your story, that a certain amount of crime is really to be expected among cops. Explain that.
So there was a big study in 2016 out of Bowling Green State University, and criminal justice researchers there took press clippings between 2005 and 2011 and analyzed those and analyzed the outcomes of it. And what they determined was that police crime is not uncommon and that it is likely a product of the occupation itself. And what they meant by that was police are constantly surrounded by crime, and it's not uncommon for them to veer into it themselves. It's one explanation. It doesn't explain every instance, obviously, but there's a serious lack of research across the United States on this topic, and really not a lot of people are looking into it. So that study is kind of the gold standard in this case.
And that kind of follows that the numbers from the post numbers and just the numbers in general regarding police officers and crime and criminal acts, they're not really reliable. They remain sketchy, don't they? They're just not forthcoming with this information.
It's certainly incomplete, and we noticed that right away because some of the most high-profile cases over the last couple of years were missing from that
ones
list.
That made the papers and made the headlines. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we found not only cases that had escaped the attention of the press, but those that should have been on this list, which suggested to us that the state isn't keeping a very close eye on these officers.
Now, the courts tend to be lenient given the danger cops face, danger many might face in prison. Some police departments are tougher than others, though, when these instances come to light, right?
Yeah, they are and they aren't. It's inconsistent again. So we found examples of officers being charged with domestic violence, pleading down to property damage, and then losing their jobs. And then we found the exact same situation, similar set of circumstances and facts, and that person going on to keep their job. So we realized over the course of reporting that the state doesn't have any clear standards on when to fire a police officer. They allow local jurisdictions to figure that out. California is actually one of 5 states that doesn't automatically decertify a police officer if you've been convicted of a crime. So that's where this conversation is going to go next. And a couple of lawmakers up in Sacramento this week who are positioned on both the Assembly and the Senate's public safety committees have come out and said, it's time for us to reevaluate that. And the police unions themselves have said, we're open to the conversation of firing a police officer for certain misconduct or even certain misdemeanors, but we want to make sure that their due process and the appeals are available for them to take. It's an interesting argument because if you're convicted of a crime, you've already gone through due process, so I don't know how the unions are going to necessarily square that, but that's the argument they're going to try to make, which is that, sure, we can talk about decertifying police officers, but let's make sure it's fair.
All right, a few seconds left on this segment. I just wanted to see what kind of feedback you've had from the audience, from readers on this.
It's been mixed. It's been mostly positive. I think people were surprised that police officers aren't automatically fired, even for more severe misdemeanors. The police officers, the Police Chiefs Association in California did come out and they basically said, well, you only found 630 names. It's less than 1% of the total. And we were pretty clear from the outset that the point of the stories was not to highlight the numbers necessarily, as how are officers treated within that system. That was the bigger issue that we wanted to explore, and people can judge that for themselves.
All right, well, we'll look for follow-ups and see if the numbers get a little more solid as we move forward. Well, we're going to move on. It's known by the shorthand DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These are the 700,000 U.S. residents brought here illegally as children. They're the dreamers, allowed to legally work and go to school if they can meet certain requirements and pass a background check. That was the program begun in 2012 under President Barack Obama, one Donald Trump and the Republicans want to end, and let the deportations begin. Now, Max, start with the case before the U.S. Supreme Court this week, centered on the DACA program. How did it get there?
The Trump administration last year, or I guess in 2017, canceled the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. This was after, during the campaign, the Trump, the candidate, saying that he had no interest in deporting these individuals, and yet they still made the cancellation. Their argument at the time was that this is indefensible in court. So they moved to cancel it. States like California then sued. These lawsuits got consolidated, and that's how we end up at the Supreme Court this week.
And Trump has said, I think even since he's been president, they don't have anything to fear under me, and yet here we are, as you say, in the Supreme Court this week.
Right, yeah, and honestly, the difference between how immigration law gets enforced and what comes out of the president's mouth is there's a wide gap, right? So he could say, if you lose this status, you're not going to be deported, but what's actually happening on the ground and the ways that people interact with local law enforcement, the way they get shuffled into ICE custody, or the way ICE conducts its operations is very, very far from the purview of the president.
Now, the arguments themselves in front of the Supreme Court this week, chief argument of the U.S. Solicitor General representing the administration, what was his theme?
His argument was that this wasn't legal in the first place. There was no way that the president gets to decide what are the priorities for who should be removed from the U.S. So it goes back to basically, we can't defend this because it's not legal, and thus we're not even going to bother to continue the program. That being said, they did continue the program for a short amount of time, and to this day, people can still renew their DACA. Who already have DACA, they can still renew it.
And it seems like maybe an inconsistency with the president declaring the Muslim ban, for example, which you can keep people out, we can declare that, but we can't say who can remain here, seems this argument.
Right. I mean, to try to make any consistency in the kind of policy coming out of this White House is very tough. I would say that kind of across the board, it's tried to restrict the ability of people who are not citizens to work and live in the U.S. So that's pretty uniform.
And the back and forth among justices in that hearing, the future of DACA, how did that look to veteran court observers?
So it's obviously tough to divine from just the questions they ask. Oftentimes they have...
It surprises you after the questioning, you know.
Exactly. They have very specific things that they're looking into, but this did kind of break along the liberal and conservative ends of the bench. Especially people were looking at Chief Justice John Roberts, who's become the swing vote, and he seemed to be focusing on the idea that DACA was for work permits and gave people authorization to work here as opposed to facing possible deportation. That kind of tipped his hand a little bit to how he's ultimately going to rule, which is what the liberal judges were looking at, the human element of it, and he seemed not all that interested in that. So walking away, a lot of people saying, listen, take what you can from court arguments, but it's looking like they are leaning towards the Trump administration's opinion on this.
And as I said earlier, the Trump's declarations on this and his administration's actions, it all gets rather muddled.
Yeah, so again, the Trump administration can absolutely say we have no intention of deporting these individuals, and then the next tweet can say things like many of these people are criminals, right? So you're kind of selling a way that you have it both ways, that says I'm not going to deport these individuals. However, if they do fit certain, qualifications, like they run into the criminal justice system, or they so happen to end up on a database that's like a gang database or something like that, all of a sudden an individual can be deported. And it's not as if the Trump administration isn't actively deporting Dreamers or hasn't in the past deported DACA recipients.
Shalina?
Yeah, I was going to say, under the Obama administration, deportations were happening a lot too. Do you feel like in the age of Twitter, it's making it so that, I guess, the responsibility or the blame is being shifted kind of, or being put in different ways?
Like that the blame is being put on the immigrants themselves?
Yeah.
The one thing that the government has engaged in for quite some time is social media surveillance. So the idea that going and registering with the government to get your DACA puts you on the radar of the government so you could easily be deported, which, is the big fear of DACA recipients, kind of undersells how much the government is already observing immigrant communities. They have invested a lot of money, a lot of private contractors have spent a lot of money observing these groups. If these kind of wholesale, deportations were to begin. And, I think they'd be very difficult to pull off, but there are a lot of resources there.
Now, this ruling would be generally expected around June, the middle of the campaign season there in 2020. And Solicitor General said, we own this, meaning the administration. They're taking responsibility for this. Terribly unpopular in California. 85%, including many Republicans in California, want the Dreamers to be protected. How do you think this will play politically? So many Americans on both sides feel the Dreamers should be allowed to stay.
Yeah, right. It plays to, a nativist base that Trump has kind of drawn from. And in turn, that's shown a massive increase in Latino votes in the midterm as 2018 as compared to 2014. These things will continue to track up. And of course, this will already, the Democrats will probably already have a nominee by the time this comes down, and it's kind of on them to provide an alternate path, right? Is it going to just be that we support something that looks like deferred action, or we're going to propose a moratorium on deportations like Bernie Sanders has had, or is it going to be much more like what Biden has proposed, which is more in line with the Obama administration saying, if you pass these background checks, you get to stay. So
really interesting to see how this will play out next year and what the ruling will be. Now, if they were to be deported, these are people who haven't been to places they're being deported to and perhaps don't speak the language, maybe don't know much about the culture, and it's like, landing literally in a foreign country. What happens to these young people?
Yeah, so I really want to downplay just off the bat, the idea of kind of large-scale roundups. And I said earlier that the government does have the resources to know where people are at and track them down. But the legal mechanisms that a lot of these individuals will have at their disposal, these are people who have been in the country for a very long time, who are professionals who work. I mean, we're talking doctors, dentists,
Lawyers.
Lawyers, yes, absolutely. That one of the people arguing in court was a DACA recipient. So, the actual deportation of these individuals would be a very long, drawn-out process that I doubt would be finished within a single presidential term.
So, a whole other animal, yeah.
It's a whole other animal, but, basically, a lot of what the Trump administration has done is to speed up the ability to remove people through expedited removal, to get people out of the country very quickly. So clearly these are people who are well aware of their rights, have known it for some time, and would have to be extremely aware of how they interact with law enforcement, when they leave the house, whether they bring proof that they have lived in this country for some time, and have a kind of chain of custody for their kids, things like that. It's pretty dark.
All right, we're out of time on this segment, but it's fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be watching it as we go forward, certainly with that Supreme Court decision coming. Well, reasonable adults realize tragedy could strike at any moment, a deadly car accident, a dreadful diagnosis, or a devastating fire. But it's human nature to believe it will never happen to us until it does. Living in Southern California means living each year through the ever-expanding wildfire season. But it's different for those who've actually been directly hit by the fire, just as it's one thing to serve in the military, quite another to survive combat. So, Shalina, many survivors of combat and of wildfire here have something in common, right?
Yes, they may be susceptible to developing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. In any traumatic event, people are likely to develop stress, but clinically, after about 6 months, a psychologist might diagnose you with the actual disorder, meaning you have long-term symptoms of experiencing that stress.
And of course, unfortunately, in San Diego community, you look back to the major fires we had, 2003, I believe it was around 2,200 homes were destroyed. In 2007, another 1,600, my ballpark figure if I recall. Other fires since then, you'll have scores or dozens of homes lost. We're talking about a lot of people in our community, right?
Yeah, millions of people can be displaced at any given time, and that's kind of how stress, post-traumatic stress develops with these incidents. It's unpredictable, it's uncontrollable.
Now, those whose houses were destroyed by wildfire, generally, how would PTSD manifest itself?
Yeah, so it's a sense of personal belongings being lost, feeling like you don't have control over the situation, feeling like all of a sudden your life is completely changed. When you lose your house and a lot of the personal belongings in that, you are losing a lot of sentimental items that you may not realize that you may be very connected to. There's also the stress of the event itself can put a lot of stress on your body and on the human psyche. So
the adrenaline rush.
The adrenaline rush.
Got to get the kids out. Where's the dog? Where's the cat?
Exactly. And a lot of these symptoms can develop over a long time. And part of the reporting that I did on this is that it's actually very unpredictable whether you might develop long-term symptoms, because there are varying factors. If you have been experiencing stress before an event, you might be more likely to develop long-term symptoms because you're already experiencing
And this would just
trauma.
enhance it, this tragedy.
It would just enhance it. And there's also a lot of studies out there that say that are showing that some people might be genetically predisposed to developing post-traumatic stress symptoms. There's a lot of work that's happening through the Department of Veteran Affairs to collect a massive database of genetic material from veterans of war. And they've found that actually some research has shown that people might develop a stress hormone, or some people with existing conditions like schizophrenia might be more likely to develop PTSD.
Now, your story features a Rancho Bernardo couple who lost their rental home there in 2007, hadn't been here very long, and all of a sudden the fire hits. They escape with their 2 children. Summarize that story for us.
Yeah, so this family moved to San Diego. They were here for about 6 months. They were living in Seattle. They had not experienced wildfire season ever. And then all of a sudden they woke up and everything around them was in flames. They had to act very quickly. They made it to an evacuation center, but found out the next day that their house had burned down. And because they were so unprepared for it, they left a lot of materials in their home that they realized they were really going to feel sorry about losing.
I can only imagine for people who've lost loved ones in a fire. We had 81 deaths in that Paradise Fire in Northern California last year. It's got to be just magnitudes worse.
Absolutely. There's a lot of reporting about people who are re-experiencing burns and how it just results in them completely reliving the first traumatic event. And that can be really tough, especially if you put the work in to go to counseling and all of a sudden you re-experience that same trauma again.
And, excuse me, your story shows it really starts in the evacuation shelter, maybe the adrenaline rush of getting out of the house, the kids are safe, we're here, and all of a sudden it starts hitting you what's going on.
Yeah, it really provides sort of a window into, when we think about emergencies and disasters, we think about material necessities like food and water and clothing and shelter. And speaking to some professionals at the Red Cross who are emergency responders, they explain as soon as the event happens, you also have to think about your mental health, because you are going through that processing in your mind already, trying to figure out what happened, what your next steps are going to be. So, out of this, it really shows mental health really has to be a part of those first emergency steps.
And I imagine we're seeing some counselors there. Of course, we've gotten unfortunately better at this as we've had more and more fires over the years, but they have resource people at the shelters, they have insurance people, they have other folks, but I imagine counselors now are stepping up and starting even in that early. Yeah,
there's some publicly available services. For example, the Red Cross, as I featured in my story, has counselors that they deploy all across the state in different parts of the country when emergencies like natural disasters happen. And even San Diego County Supervisor Nathan Fletcher said that he was going to voted up a program that would provide mental health services for first emergency responders like firefighters. So there's a larger conversation happening around providing mental health services, but obviously there can always be more resources available for people.
Mm-hmm. Jesse?
Is that also a topic of conversation politically? Because I know there's going to be a ballot measure next year dealing with sprawl out in wildfire zones. We're in a housing crisis, but is the psychological effect of what's happening to people who've experienced this, do you think that's going to be part of the political discussion? Has Fletcher given any sense of that as well?
I don't know if it's going to be part of the discussion for individuals, for people who are actually owning the homes. I think it's been a part of the larger conversation for folks like firefighters and police officers that are experiencing these traumatic events kind of firsthand, dealing with them continuously. But in terms of individual homeowners, I'm not as sure that they're going to be part of that conversation on public mental health services being available.
I wonder too, we read about the PTSD with soldiers and the folks who survive and get back and had to bury their buddies back on the battlefield, have survivor's guilt. And I wonder about the folks who are, my neighbor's house burned down, my house was just fine. I wonder if they're impacted as well,
I'm sure. I think the takeaway from this and talking to psychologists is that the idea that everybody needs to realize is that when a traumatic event happens, you will be impacted by it. It doesn't matter who you are, how far away you are from a fire or from an earthquake. There will be a sense of, can this happen again, within you. So yeah, I'm sure that that everyone who was experienced the event, whether you survived it, whether you lost your home, you're going to be impacted by it in some kind of way. You might smell smoke in the air and wonder, is the fire going to come to my home this time?
Yeah, if nothing else, your invulnerability, as we were saying at the outset, is shattered. You know this can happen to you. It happened to my neighbor.
Yeah, that's kind of how these psychological conditions kind of develop, as a sense of losing control. Will I be able to react in this situation? And, one of the symptoms of PTSD is emotional detachment. You don't want to relive an experience. You don't want to think that something can happen to you.
All right, well, we're out of time, but hopefully the rains will come soon and we can put this off and not worry about fires again this season for a while. Well, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Shalina Chetlani of KPBS News, Jesse Marks of Voice of San Diego, and Max Ridlin-Nadler of KPBS News. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.